What if the most terrifying secrets of medieval power were not hidden in dungeons, but behind the smile of a noblewoman everyone believed was the perfect lady of her estate? The deeper researchers dug into her life, the more they realized that the real horror was never written in the official chronicles. It lived in the shadows of her household, quietly shaping the fate of every servant who stepped inside her walls. At first glance, she appeared like any other respected noblewoman. Educated, dignified, charitable in public ceremonies. Yet something about the silence surrounding her servants felt unnaturally heavy. Too many gaps, too many disappearances justified as sudden illness or necessary dismissal. Historians would later say that the first clue was not in what they found, but in what everyone else avoided mentioning. The records that survived show hints, not confessions, scribbles in the margins of old letters, vague notes from household visitors, inventory lists that did not match the number of workers the estate supposedly employed. Each fragment was harmless on its own, but when placed together, they formed a disturbing outline. Why did every servant who left her home describe the same suffocating atmosphere? Why did some refuse to speak at all, as if naming her was dangerous? One researcher said the fear felt fresh, even after centuries, like the walls themselves remembered what had happened. This noblewoman mastered the art of duality. In public, she donated candles to churches and hosted winter feasts. In private, she enforced obedience with methods subtle enough to escape legal attention, yet brutal enough to crush a person without leaving visible scars. Servants were assigned contradictory tasks designed to guarantee failure. Punishments were delivered in calm tones, as if discipline was merely part of the natural order. She understood that physical pain heals, but psychological captivity corrodes slowly, invisibly, completely. And so, she built a system where the body worked, the hands obeyed, but the spirit eventually broke. Researchers today believe her power came from the same force that made so many medieval elites untouchable: reputation. She was born into a family respected for generations, protected by alliances that discouraged questioning. Anyone who tried to expose her risked social isolation or retaliation. That fear allowed her cruelty to remain hidden in plain sight. The deeper historians traced her steps, the more they uncovered patterns that suggested her servants were not just workers, but instruments in a private game of dominance, humiliation, and control. And just when the investigation seemed complete, another fragment of evidence surfaced, hinting that what they thought they understood was only the beginning of a far darker truth waiting beneath the surface. Before we continue unfolding the layers of what truly happened inside her household, share your thoughts in the comments, especially if any detail here reminded you of how power can twist the human mind. Leave a like to help this investigation reach more people, and check if you are already subscribed to the channel so you do not miss the next revelations. Now let us move forward, because the shadows around this noblewoman are only starting to take shape, and what comes next exposes a kind of power few ever dared to confront. What made her domination even more unsettling was the invisible structure that allowed it to flourish inside the medieval household. Servants in that era did not simply work for a noble family. They belonged to it in a hierarchy that left no room for resistance. A noblewoman had far more control over her domestic world than most imagine today. And this particular lady understood every thread of that power. She could dictate where her servants slept, what they wore, who they spoke to, and exactly how they spent every waking hour. Researchers later realized that this absolute authority created the perfect landscape for manipulation, because it blurred the line between duty and coercion. And in households like hers, obedience was not just expected, it was inherited, enforced, and normalized. Historical documents reveal that the medieval household functioned like a self-contained world where the lady's word operated as law. She oversaw punishment, reward, discipline, and order, often without interference from male guardians who were busy with political affairs, travel, or warfare. That autonomy gave noblewomen enormous influence behind closed doors, and while many used it to maintain peace and structure, others used it to shape a culture of fear that remained hidden from the outside world. Her servants lived under a constant awareness that a single misstep could trigger consequences far beyond a simple reprimand. In such an environment, even silence became a survival strategy. What strikes modern researchers is how psychological control served as her primary weapon. She never had to shout or raise a hand. Her authority operated through expectation and implication, through the unspoken understanding that she saw everything and forgot nothing. Servants learned to read her moods as if their lives depended on it, because in many ways, they did. The household functioned on a rhythm dictated by her presence. The sound of her steps in a corridor could shift the entire atmosphere. Some documents suggest that she used this awareness deliberately, manipulating routines to create instability and keep her servants in a constant state of vigilance. The medieval social structure amplified this effect. A servant could not simply leave or seek help. Their survival depended on the family they served, and accusations against a noblewoman, especially one with alliances and status, were dismissed long before being heard. Researchers note that this environment made psychological punishment more effective than physical violence. A bruise could be seen, fear could not. And, in the world she shaped, fear became the foundation of loyalty. Several testimonies recorded generations later describe servants who obeyed her, even when they were far from her presence, as if her influence lingered inside their minds long after they escaped her estate. That lingering obedience is what convinced historians that her power was not just social, but psychological, a force crafted intentionally to ensure her dominance reached deeper than any rule or reputation could explain. As historians continued piecing together the fragments of her household, the most revealing clues emerged not from dramatic confessions, but from the mundane documents no one expected to matter. A crumpled letter found in a monastery archive mentioned her necessary corrections. An inventory list from her estate recorded far fewer linens than the number of servants supposedly employed, as if entire rooms had been emptied overnight. Even the church registers hinted at domestic burdens that required indulgences, a subtle code often used when the wealthy needed absolution for deeds best left unspoken. These details seemed trivial at first, but once researchers compared them, they realized they were looking at a pattern carefully concealed beneath layers of everyday bureaucracy. The most unsettling discoveries came from cross-referencing records of servants who vanished from her estate without explanation. Some were listed as having died of sudden fevers, a common medieval excuse that covered countless abuses. Others were recorded as dismissed, yet no nearby village had any trace of them afterward. The repetition of the same vague phrases suggested more than coincidence. Researchers began to suspect that the missing names represented the most vulnerable individuals in her household, those she targeted with the quiet precision of someone who understood exactly how to erase people without drawing attention. More evidence appeared in private letters exchanged between neighboring nobles. While they never accused her directly, their tone revealed discomfort. They described her as strict in her governance and unyielding in matters of household discipline, phrases that, in medieval aristocratic language, often signaled fear rather than respect. One noblewoman wrote that visiting the estate felt like walking through a place where voices had been swallowed whole. That cryptic description became a focal point for modern historians because it implied that her cruelty had reached a level so normalized within her home that outsiders sensed it without witnessing a single act. The strongest breakthrough came from a set of inherited papers belonging to a minor cleric who had served her family. Among them were small handwritten notes that recorded fines, punishments, and private corrections, many of which were unusually harsh for the period. There were mentions of servants forced into isolation for days, workers punished for failing impossible tasks, and others denied food for reasons described only as acts of necessary discipline. These entries were brief, but their cold neutrality struck researchers as deliberate, as if the writer feared documenting too much. Each new fragment pulled historians further into the silent machinery that kept her cruelty hidden. They realized that these scattered documents were never meant to survive. They remained only because they were tucked inside unrelated archives, forgotten by families who had no idea of their significance. And as the pieces finally began to form a coherent picture, the question shifted from whether she was guilty to how deeply her control infiltrated the daily lives of those trapped under her authority. A truth that would soon lead investigators into the darkest parts of her private world. What researchers uncovered next was far more disturbing than missing names or vague records. It was the emotional architecture she built inside her estate. A system crafted not to punish bodies, but to dismantle identities piece by piece. Servants described tasks that shifted unpredictably, rules that changed without warning, and expectations designed to ensure failure. One day a servant was praised for meticulous work. The next day, the same effort was condemned as insolence. This unpredictability was not accidental. It conditioned the household to exist in a constant state of anticipation, as if every moment carried the potential for humiliation. Humiliation was her most refined weapon. She never needed to scream or strike. She simply exposed weaknesses strategically, often in front of other servants, turning embarrassment into a spectacle. A misplaced item became an accusation of incompetence. A spilled drink transformed into a moral failing. Those moments were small on the surface, but they accumulated like layers of dust that eventually smothered the will to resist. Servants learned to anticipate her disapproval before it was voiced, modifying their posture, tone, or breathing the moment she entered a room. That level of instinctive submission is what convinced modern historians that her cruelty was not sporadic, but systematic, engineered to establish psychological dominance that reached far beyond the walls of her estate. Isolation played an equally crucial role. Servants who displeased her, often for reasons no one could decipher, were separated from others and assigned to distant corners of the manor, performing lonely tasks from dawn to dusk. These isolations could last hours, days, even weeks, and always without explanation. The uncertainty of whether they would ever be reintegrated created a fear deeper than physical punishment. Some records hint that long-term isolation led to moments of breakdown, where servants begged to return even if it meant facing harsher tasks. That desperation became another tool in her control, reinforcing the idea that proximity to her, even in fear, was preferable to being forgotten completely. What makes these methods particularly chilling is that they left almost no physical evidence. Medieval courts rarely intervened in domestic affairs unless injuries were severe or public. Her strategies operated below that threshold. Emotional erosion cannot be catalogued like bruises. It lingers invisibly, dissolving courage until obedience becomes the only safe state. When historians compared testimonies across different archives, they found the same pattern. Servants describing a home where hope felt like an indulgence they could no longer afford, where the lady of the manor could strip dignity away with a look, a phrase, or a moment of silence that lasted just long enough to unsettle the soul. If you sensed something in these descriptions that reveals how power can turn into a weapon when no one is watching, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters as we continue uncovering the hidden layers of this story. What emerged from the deeper layers of the investigation was a set of punishment practices that blurred the line between discipline and ritual. These were not spontaneous bursts of anger, nor the crude violence often associated with harsh medieval households. They followed patterns, repeated behaviors, and symbolic gestures that suggested intention rather than impulse. Researchers discovered references to a secluded room at the back of the manor, a place rarely entered by visitors and mentioned only in scattered servant notes as the quiet chamber. It was there, historians believe, that she delivered the punishments that no one dared describe openly. The methods attributed to her were disturbingly calculated. Servants were sometimes summoned late at night, forced to stand for hours under the cold glow of a single candle, while she delivered calm, measured reprimands that cut deeper than shouting ever could. Some records imply that she used religious objects not as instruments of faith, but as symbols of authority, touching a rosary to a servant's forehead while explaining their failures in a tone of serene disappointment. This merging of sacred imagery with psychological torment created a twisted form of ritual punishment that left victims confused about whether they were being corrected, condemned, or purified for her own satisfaction. More chilling still were accounts of servants being required to witness the punishment of others. These forced spectators were placed close enough to feel the tension, but far enough that they could do nothing to help. The purpose was clear: to reinforce her dominance not only over the punished individual, but over everyone who observed. By making her servants complicit in the humiliation of their peers, she deepened their sense of powerlessness and blurred moral boundaries within the household. Researchers note that this tactic appears in other historical cases of systemic abuse, but its presence here was unusually refined, as if orchestrated by someone who understood exactly how to fracture loyalty and replace it with fear. There are also hints that she kept certain symbolic items in the punishment chamber, objects described in fragmentary notes as tokens of memory or reminders of obedience. Historians debate their purpose. Some believe they were tools used to mark specific servants, leaving subtle scars meant to reinforce submission. Others argue they were merely props intended to heighten the atmosphere of dread. Whatever their function, their repeated appearance in unrelated documents suggests a ritualistic mindset, not merely a disciplinary one. These practices seemed designed not only to assert power, but to create a psychological environment where her authority felt absolute and unquestionable. Servants learned over time that punishment from her was not simply about correcting mistakes. It was a performance, a display of control, and a reminder that she dictated not just their actions, but their emotional reality. And as historians continued following these threads, they began to understand why so many records describing her household avoided direct accusations. The truth was not just violent. It was structured, rehearsed, and woven into the very fabric of how her estate functioned, leading investigators toward an even darker revelation buried in the century-old silence surrounding her reign. What puzzled historians most was not the brutality of her actions, but how effectively she concealed them for so long. Medieval society was built on reputation, lineage, and alliances, and she understood these pillars better than most. Her family name granted her a shield that ordinary people could never penetrate. Any whisper against her character was dismissed before it fully formed, swallowed by a system designed to protect the upper ranks from scrutiny. Servants who attempted to speak out found themselves ignored, discredited, or quietly removed from public awareness. In some cases, their testimonies were recorded only in the margins of unrelated manuscripts, hints that their words had been intentionally pushed out of official history. Researchers found evidence that she manipulated the people who wrote the narratives of her era. Scribes relied on noble patronage, and a single favor or gift could influence how events were documented. Letters show that she frequently donated to local churches at strategic moments, often right after unexplained incidents occurred in her household. Those donations served not only as gestures of piety, but as subtle reminders of her influence. Priests who depended on her support described her as virtuous, generous, and devout, creating a public image that stood in stark contrast to what servants experienced behind closed doors. She also cultivated allies among neighboring families. Her estate hosted feasts, negotiations, and gatherings that strengthened bonds with powerful figures. These social ties formed a protective ring that discouraged accusations. Anyone who challenged her actions risked offending not just her, but the network she carefully maintained. Historians believe that this web of alliances was one of her most effective tools. It ensured that even if someone attempted to expose her, the complaint would die quietly, suffocated by political courtesy and fear of retaliation. Another layer of protection came from her ability to control information within her own estate. Servants were intentionally isolated from one another, making it nearly impossible for them to compare experiences or build a unified voice. Those who were punished most severely were often reassigned immediately afterward, moved to distant tasks that kept them away from others. Over time, this fragmentation created confusion about what was real and what was rumor. Each servant saw only a portion of the truth, never enough to understand the full magnitude of her actions. Historians also uncovered subtle signs of intimidation. Some documents referenced warnings, reminders of loyalty, or corrections for insolence, written in vague terms that concealed their real meaning. The tone of these notes suggested that she did not need to threaten anyone directly. Her presence, her reputation, and her precise control of the household created an environment where fear did the work for her. Servants learned to police themselves, avoiding conversations, avoiding questions, and avoiding any behavior that could be interpreted as defiance. This self-censorship was perhaps her most powerful weapon, because it ensured that the truth remained buried for generations. By the time researchers pieced together these layers of manipulation, they realized her power did not simply rely on violence. It relied on silence, a silence she crafted deliberately, maintained obsessively, and enforced through every mechanism available to a noblewoman of her time. And just when they thought they understood the full extent of her hidden authority, new evidence surfaced that pushed the investigation into an even more revealing direction, one that challenged everything they believed about the limits of her control. The investigation reached a turning point when historians began cross-referencing documents that, for centuries, had been stored in different regions and forgotten in private collections. Individually, each source revealed almost nothing, but together, they formed a blueprint of her cruelty that no one had recognized before. It started with a travel diary written by a merchant who had visited her estate. He mentioned, almost in passing, the unusual stillness of her servants, and noted that the atmosphere inside the manor felt colder than the winter outside. That simple line, overlooked for generations, suddenly appeared significant when matched with other accounts describing the same unsettling silence that seemed to follow her servants everywhere. Other discoveries came from estate records kept by families who later inherited parts of her land. Among them were scribbled notations about old debts, forgotten personnel, and previous obligations, phrases historians now interpret as references to the servants who suffered under her rule. One particularly revealing ledger listed a series of sudden household expenses, medical supplies, unexpected burial fees, and payments to rural healers, clustered around the same short period of time. The pattern suggested that something severe had happened, something the estate attempted to manage quietly and swiftly. But the most illuminating document was a small bundle of parchment found inside a damaged chest in a monastery library. It contained notes from a young cleric who had briefly served at her estate. His writings were cautious, even frightened. He described being asked to bless certain rooms repeatedly, far more often than was customary. He mentioned hearing muffled cries during evening prayers and observing servants who flinched at the sight of the noblewoman's shadow on the corridor walls. Though he never accused her directly, his unease seeped through every word. When historians aligned these fragments with genealogical records, they noticed an alarming pattern. Servants associated with her estate often had shorter recorded lifespans than those working in nearby households. Some disappeared from regional documents entirely, as if their stories were deliberately severed from the historical record. This absence, repeated across decades, became one of the most powerful indicators of systemic abuse. A pattern of silence is still a pattern, and in her case, it spoke louder than any confession. As these pieces finally connected, researchers realized they were witnessing the unraveling of a truth that had slept untouched for centuries. The narrative that emerged was no longer about isolated cruelty, but about a constructed system of control that operated in shadows, protected by power and preserved by fear. And though the documents provided only glimpses, each glimpse revealed another layer of a darkness far deeper than anyone had imagined. If any part of this unfolding truth strikes you as significant, or reminds you of how easily history can bury what it does not wish to face, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps illuminate the shadows that centuries tried to keep hidden. What historians uncovered next forced them to confront the human cost of her authority in a way no document could soften. The Mao accounts of physical and psychological damage suffered by her servants emerged slowly, scattered across regional records, family archives, and medical notes written long after the victims had escaped her estate. Many of these individuals were described as arriving in nearby villages with unexplained injuries, wrists marked by deep abrasions, backs scarred with thin, deliberate lines, or hands so damaged they could no longer perform basic labor. Physicians of the time often attributed these conditions to accidents or hard work, but modern researchers noticed consistent patterns that suggested something far more deliberate. More troubling were the testimonies recorded indirectly, often through confessions or statements given to clerics who traveled through rural areas. Some servants described losing weight rapidly, suffering from sleeplessness, or experiencing episodes of shaking whenever authority figures raised their voices. One note from a parish priest mentioned a young woman who could not enter a dimly lit room without trembling uncontrollably, and though he listed melancholy as the cause, the intensity of her fear hinted at trauma rooted in systematic psychological torment. These testimonies offered glimpses of what her punishments truly inflicted, revealing not just pain, but the destruction of confidence, identity, and emotional stability. Historians also noted the eerie consistency of certain injuries. Several former servants had scars that appeared to be the result of precise, repeated actions, marks that suggested intentional infliction rather than accidents. Some had burns shaped like small circles, while others bore faint lines that appeared to have been carved with careful control. These injuries did not align with common medieval labor accidents. Instead, they carried the unmistakable signature of someone who understood how to harm without killing, how to leave reminders that reinforced submission without drawing public suspicion. Even more haunting were the long-term psychological effects. Accounts describe former servants who walked with their shoulders permanently hunched, as if expecting a blow. Others avoided eye contact or flinched when addressed directly, signs of ingrained fear that lingered long after they left her estate. A few developed compulsive behaviors, checking doors repeatedly, arranging objects with obsessive precision, or mimicking the gestures of deference they had once performed for her. Modern researchers interpret these patterns as evidence of chronic coercive control, the kind of psychological domination that reshapes a person's relationship with safety, authority, and self-worth. Perhaps the most revealing detail appeared in a small cluster of hospital records from decades after her death. Several aging former servants were admitted with unexplained frailty and described as suffering from invisible wounds of the mind. One physician noted that their fear seemed to come from memories they refused to name. Though he did not understand the concept of trauma, his description aligns closely with what we now recognize as the long-term effects of sustained psychological abuse. These fragments, when assembled, formed a chilling portrait. Her servants did not merely endure moments of cruelty. They lived in a system that sought to shape them, confine them, and ultimately break them. And as researchers confronted the weight of these testimonies, they realized that the full truth about her household still remained incomplete, pointing them toward a broader pattern of power and cruelty that extended far beyond the walls of her estate. As the investigation widened, historians began recognizing that the noblewoman's actions were not an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader, unsettling pattern found across different regions and eras. Throughout medieval and early modern history, there were women who, despite being constrained by patriarchal structures, wielded intense domestic power over those beneath them. This authority, largely invisible in official documents, gave rise to environments where cruelty could thrive without societal intervention. In many cases, noblewomen were the unchallenged rulers of their households, and their private domains operated with rules entirely separate from the public world. Her story fit disturbingly well within this hidden tradition. Researchers drew parallels to other estates where servants disappeared mysteriously, or where visitors recorded an atmosphere of tension that defied explanation. Letters written by traveling clerics, minor nobles, and merchants described women who maintained strict household codes enforced through psychological manipulation, ritualistic punishments, or coerced loyalty. Some practiced forms of humiliation so subtle they remained undetected until fragments surfaced centuries later. Others used religious symbolism, not to elevate faith, but to reinforce authority and legitimize their actions. The similarities were too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Historians also noted how these women often operated within systems designed to protect them. Their reputations as pious, refined, or charitable figures created a smokescreen that concealed their darker impulses. In several known cases, noblewomen donated to churches, funded local festivals, or supported political alliances to shield themselves from scrutiny. These gestures, recorded faithfully in public documents, obscured the suffering of servants who lived under their control. Her strategic manipulation of image and influence was not unique. It mirrored tactics used by other powerful women who shaped their households through fear rather than care. There were also clues hidden in folklore and regional legends, stories of the silent lady, the mistress who walked without sound, or the woman whose shadow preceded her footsteps, appeared in several areas where nobles wielded intense domestic authority. While these tales were embellished over generations, researchers suspect they may have originated from real figures whose behavior left deep psychological scars on entire communities. In comparing these legends with historical records, scholars identified recurring themes: vanished servants, unexplained illnesses, strict household rituals, and an oppressive atmosphere that lingered long after these women died. The deeper historians dug, the more they realized that these patterns formed a continuum, a lineage of women who turned domestic power into a tool of domination. Her estate became a case study, not just in individual cruelty, but in how unchecked authority allowed personal shadows to grow into generational trauma. Medieval society rarely questioned what happened behind noble walls, and in that silence, some women carved out realms where they reigned with an iron will shaped by secrecy and psychological control. This broader context transformed the researchers' understanding of her legacy. She was no longer merely one noble woman with a dark reputation. She was part of a historical tapestry woven from hidden rituals, suppressed testimonies, and the unrecorded suffering of servants whose stories lived only in fragments. And as the investigation approached its final layers, historians realized they were closing in on the most uncomfortable revelation. Not just what she did, but what her story exposed about the very nature of power in a world that preferred its darkest truths to remain buried. By the time historians reached the final layers of the investigation, the image of this medieval noblewoman had been completely dismantled. What emerged from the fragmented testimonies, forgotten ledgers, marginal notes, and whispered accounts was a portrait of a woman who mastered not only the mechanics of control, but the psychology behind it. Her legacy revealed how power, when concentrated and unmonitored, can shift shape until it becomes something unrecognizable, something that thrives in secrecy and feeds on silence. She represented the side of history that official narratives prefer to ignore, where cruelty is not loud or chaotic, but meticulously planned, disguised beneath refinement, and executed through rituals that fracture the human spirit. What struck researchers most was how effectively her influence outlived her. Even decades after her death, records describe former servants who carried her presence like a shadow etched into their memory. Some avoided speaking her name, as if the fear she instilled lingered beyond her lifetime. Others altered their behavior in permanent ways, speaking softly, stepping carefully, apologizing before they knew why. This long-term imprint offered the final evidence historians needed. Her power extended far beyond the physical walls of her estate. It seeped into the identities of those who survived her, reshaping their lives long after they escaped her reach. Her story also forced historians to confront a deeper truth about medieval society. Power was rarely questioned when held by men, but it was even less scrutinized when held by women who appeared pious, composed, and domestically devoted. These qualities became the perfect disguise for someone who knew how to weaponize expectation and exploit the blind spots of her culture. In exposing her, researchers were not just documenting a single woman's cruelty. They were challenging entire assumptions about gender, authority, and the ways darkness can take root beneath a polished exterior. As the investigation closed, one final question lingered. How many other stories like hers remain hidden in archives, waiting for a scholar to notice a missing name, an unusual expense, or a line in a forgotten diary that contradicts the myth of noble virtue? Her case became a reminder that history is not just what was recorded, it is also what was intentionally erased, softened, or reshaped to preserve the comfort of those in power. And in bringing her truth to light, historians exposed a reality that forces us to rethink the quiet, unseen forces that shaped entire eras. If you stayed with me until this point, you and I have walked through a part of history that was never meant to be uncovered. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment saying, "I'm here until the end," so I know you felt the weight of these revelations. And if content like this helps you see the past with new eyes, consider subscribing to the channel so you can follow the next investigations we uncover together. A like on this video also helps strengthen this community of people who seek the truths buried beneath the official stories. And if you want to continue this journey, there is another video right here that expands on these hidden dynamics of medieval power. Click and keep exploring with me.